To see Paris from the sky is to discover a rousing epic, a history book written by thousands of people who, over the centuries, have fashioned a work of immense beauty. If you don't have wings, how can you possibly appreciate the great sweeping vistas throughout the capital, or the perfect layout of its monuments, echoing each other through the ages from one bank of the Seine to the other? To soar like a bird over Paris is to glimpse secret gardens, suspended like islands in the sky. To go into raptures over the succession of bridges spanning the Seine by the dozen. To skim the spires of Notre Dame and tease the bateau mouche. To fly is to realize man's wildest dream, to embark on an unforgettable journey through time and into the soul of Paris, so rightly called the City of Light. Without the Seine, Paris would not exist. It is the most prestigious thoroughfare of all in the very heart of the city. Its banks constitute a veritable open-air museum. They boast the oldest witnesses of the capital's history, monuments of another age that silently observe the hustle and bustle of modern Parisian life. On the Ile de la Cité, a magnificent edifice rises majestically in the middle of the Seine, like an imposing sentinel watching over Paris. The medieval city's heart raced in the late 12th century when the tall spires of Notre Dame de Paris began to rise up out of the earth. The cathedral would take almost 200 years to complete. Every year, millions of visitors climb its 400 steps. People come here from all over the world to take in the illuminated gaze of the cathedral's famous gargoyles and to enjoy a son et lumière journey into the Paris of Victor Hugo's day. Boasting 5 naves and 37 chapels, the cathedral is lit by over 100 windows. A pure marvel of architecture with, among other wonders, its single-arch flying buttresses. It is hard to believe that this absolute masterpiece of Gothic art, whose foundation stone was laid by Pope Alexander III in 1163, only narrowly escaped the destructive winds of the French Revolution. The Seine is spanned by no less than 37 bridges. Despite its name, the Pont Neuf, or New Bridge at the tip of the Ile de la Cité, is the oldest of them all. Henry IV inaugurated it in 1607 and declared that, contrary to tradition, no houses would be built upon it. As a result, the Pont Neuf quickly became the heart of the city, a fashionable place to stroll. The round towers of the Conciergerie were the final home of most condemned prisoners during the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette was held in a cell here before being sent to the guillotine. 20 years later, Count de la Valette made a spectacular escape, one of the few inmates to ever do so, disguised as a woman. Via the Pont Saint-Louis, just behind Notre-Dame, the Ile de la Cité seems to be towing a smaller island, the Ile Saint-Louis. Far from the hustle and bustle of city life, this charming village was once the preferred place of residence for many personalities and writers, such as Baudelaire and Maupassant. From the tree-festooned quays to the long main street lined with chic restaurants and cafes, the island nobly displays many fine mansions, evidence of the splendors of the 17th century, the so-called Grand Siècle. One of the capital's 37 bridges is reserved for those who love to explore Paris on foot. It was Napoleon I who understood the importance of designing the Passerelle des Arts exclusively for pedestrians. This splendid panoramic viewpoint over the Seine, where walkers stroll peacefully, is a favorite meeting place for artists and a fabulous way to discover the facade of the Louvre. In the medieval landscape of Paris, the city was fortified. The Louvre occupied a defensive position on the right bank. As it appears to us today, it bears no resemblance to the fortress Philippe Auguste had built to protect the city against the Vikings. In the 16th century, Francis I razed the keep to the ground and turned the former castle into a luxurious residence in the Renaissance style. A passionate patron of Italian art, he began what would later become the museum's collection, acquiring, among many other paintings, the Mona Lisa. The 20th century also added its architectural touch to the Louvre. A fabulous entrance in the center of a 20-meter-high pyramidal diamond of glass and metal with the same proportions as the Great Pyramid of Giza. President François Mitterrand entrusted the project to I.M. Pei, a Chinese-American architect of exceptional talent. Over the centuries, this 40-hectare complex in the very heart of Paris has become the biggest and most visited museum in the world. It is hard to believe that in the 12th century, the Tuileries Garden was the site of a tile works. It was redesigned in Louis XIV's day by André Le Nôtre, turning it into the city's first public garden. Every year for the past 20 years, a fun fair has been held in the grounds, close to the prestigious Rue de Rivoli, and the Tuileries reverts to its former role as a pleasure ground. In this, the oldest and largest of Paris's parks, 25,000 plants are laid out every year by the Tuileries gardeners and watered by the Canal de l'Ourcq, which takes its supply from the Ourcq, whose headwaters lie 80 kilometers from Paris. In the very center of this busy and vibrant city, the gardens of the Palais Royal constitute a magical, timeless place whose secrets are so well hidden, many never discover them. As a child, behind the palace walls, Louis XIV learned to ride, hunt, and wage war around a miniature fort. In the 18th century, with the police forbidden to patrol the gardens, they became notorious as a meeting place for lewd encounters. "260 columns, created by the sculptor Daniel Buren, took root in the ground beneath the main courtyard in 1987. Striped black and white, they spring up at varying heights, creating a modern rhythm in stark contrast to the traditional courtyard. A stone's throw from the Palais Royal, the Place des Victoires was designed as the resplendent setting for a statue in honor of the Sun King. The present royal effigy dates from the 19th century, as the original bronze statue was melted down at the time of the Revolution. For 8 centuries, the quarter Zola described as the belly of Paris fed the capital. Even though its role has now changed for good, it still bears the same name, Les Halles. This quarter is a harmonious blend of the Paris of today and of yesteryear. The Église Saint-Eustache, a survivor of the demolition of Les Halles in the 1970s, has seen many illustrious parishioners over the centuries. Madame de Pompadour, Richelieu, not to mention Louis XIV, who made his first communion here. As for Molière, he ridiculed the church so much, the priest of Saint-Eustache refused him a religious burial. Victor Hugo humorously likened the dome of the Bourse du Commerce, which began life as the corn exchange, to a jockey's cap without a peak. To the left of the building, this curious column is said to have served as an observatory for Catherine de' Medici's astrologer, the famous Ruggieri. Underground, the old market halls have given way to a huge shopping centre, and on the surface, to airy gardens where passers-by come to rest and watch the children play. Proud of its royal architecture, Paris also constantly reinvents its cultural heritage. A stone's throw from Les Halles, the Pompidou Centre proudly displays its structure and the colourful cladding of its vital organs, blue, green, red and yellow pipes. Inaugurated in 1977, this hive of cultural activity, which the Parisians simply call Beaubourg, has attracted over 150 million visitors since it opened. Its Museum of Modern Art is world famous. From revolutions to celebrations, and from celebrations to executions, the neo-Renaissance Hôtel de Ville, or City Hall, has been the scene of major events marking the history of Paris. Louis XVI mumbled a few words when he pinned the tricolour cockade to his hat, and Robespierre found refuge here during the Revolution. He was guillotined the following day. The Tour Saint-Jacques stands as a tribute to all those who for 8 centuries made the vibrant quarter of Les Halles into Paris's biggest market. It is all that remains of the old 16th century church of Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie, whose powerful butchers' guild financed the bell tower. In the Middle Ages, the left bank became the center of learning of the whole of Western Europe. In the Latin Quarter, all classes were given in Latin. Today, one name alone still awakens its glorious intellectual past: the Sorbonne. This huge quadrilateral complex of severe and monastic-looking tall buildings was the site of the first college founded in the heart of this quarter. The Sorbonne had already welcomed scholars from all over Europe when Louis XV, who was cured at the last minute of a sudden fever, decided to erect a church a few streets away, dedicated to Sainte Geneviève, to whom he attributed his miraculous recovery. Now called the Panthéon, this church stands on top of the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève and dominates the Paris skyline. Soon after the Battle of Verdun, in which 50,000 Muslims lost their lives, the foundation stone was laid of the Grand Mosque of Paris, the only one of its kind in the city. A place of worship, this mini Alhambra in the Spanish Moorish style is a timeless oasis of calm and refinement, where families come to sip mint tea in its flower-filled patios. Between the Grand Mosque and the Seine, the Jardin des Plantes has always welcomed scientists and explorers. This botanical garden was established as a royal garden of medicinal plants in the reign of Louis XIII. The garden and its buildings are listed historic monuments. Opened in 1795, its menagerie is one of the oldest in the world. As for its glass houses, they are among the oldest metal structures in Europe. Nowadays, the garden and the menagerie are an absolute must for children as places to learn and to play. With ever-changing exhibitions, the museum and the Grand Gallery of Evolution remain a world-class resource for all those interested in the natural sciences. Next to the Jardin des Plantes, still in the center of Paris, the Institute of the Arab World offers a radical change of style and era. The museum, laid out over several floors around a patio, is resolutely modern in design. Its top-floor terrace provides an unrestricted view of Notre Dame Cathedral. The fruit of a partnership between France and 22 Arab countries, this highly original building by Jean Nouvel seems to hug the curves of the Seine. Between the river and the railway tracks of the Austerlitz station, in the new Paris Rive Gauche sector, stands a truly unique building, the BNF, the French National Library. Designed by architect Dominique Perrault, the library consists of 4 glass towers shaped like open books, which reflect the orangey hues of the setting sun. Since 1997, the National Library has housed several million books. In the words of its designer, the complex features a large modern abbey whose sunken cloisters create a space conducive to meditation. On the other side of the Seine, a stunning structure faces the National Library, the Bercy Sports Palace. This monumental, truncated, pyramid-shaped structure blends into its surroundings thanks to its sloping, grass-covered walls. A trick to minimize visual impact by making it appear lower. This huge 17,000-seater venue can host an incredible variety of events, from the World Windsurfing Championship to concerts by the world's greatest entertainers. Every native Parisian has played as a child in the Luxembourg Gardens, a formal French garden whose well-ordered charm of centuries past remains intact. Children push toy sailboats around its octagonal pond, go to see the Punch and Judy show, and stop for candy at the same little wooden huts as their grandparents. This building, which was formerly the residence of Mary de' Medici, is now the Senate Palace. Just along the road from the Luxembourg Gardens lies the Observatoire. It is the world's oldest operating observatory. The building straddles the Paris meridian, and its sides face the cardinal points of the compass. It is here, within these very walls, that the first scientific map of the moon was produced in 1697. The Paris Observatory remains one of the world's leading centers for astronomical and astrophysical research. Opened in the 1900s, the Paris Metro crisscrosses the capital, covering every corner of the city. Occasionally, it soars over the rooftops of Paris, as Edith Piaf sang so poetically. The lion defying the traffic in the middle of the Place d'Enfer Rochereau is a tribute to the heroism of the people of Alsace during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Bartholdi's original sculpture is located in the city of Belfort, a colossal 22-meter-long lion carved out of the sandstone of a hill overlooking the city. Since 1972, the Tour Montparnasse has towered imposingly over the district after which it is named. In the 1920s, the quarter's low-rent artist studios and wealth of cafes helped foster a spirit of competition as well as mutual aid. In an atmosphere of creativity, the Montparnasse made their home, bringing together many talented artists, poets, and musicians. For Modigliani, Picasso, and Apollinaire, among others, it became the neighborhood of choice. At 210 meters high, this office block was the tallest in Europe for many years. From the top, on a clear day, visitors can enjoy a spectacular panoramic view of the whole city. A few lucky people live on the water in the heart of Paris. Since 1983, the capital's former commercial port, just below the Place de la Bastille, has been a marina, the Port de l'Arsenal. The gilded Spirit of Freedom atop the July column glistens in the sun in the middle of the Place de la Bastille, marking the site of the prison stormed by the mob at the start of the French Revolution in 1789. In this place, synonymous with freedom, the naked angel stretches out its wings, holding in one hand the broken chains of despotism and, in the other, the torch of civilization. The outline of the huge destroyed fortress is still visible on the ground. Built for the people, this square became gentrified with the opening of trendy cafes and the new Bastille Opera House. All curves and glass, its 2,700-seater auditorium has remarkable acoustics. A stone's throw away lies the Place des Vosges, commissioned by Henry IV as a masterpiece of elegance. The first party was held here in 1612 in great pomp and splendor. For 2 days, in front of 100,000 spectators, 2,000 performers, as well as elephants and bears, took part in a grand spectacle and procession for the marriage of Louis XIII. For years, the Place des Vosges was the meeting place of high society in Europe. Several squares, each more prestigious than the last, mark the capital's identity. The Place de la République, laid out during the Second Empire, intersected by long, grand boulevards created by Baron Haussmann. The Place de la Bourse and its majestic Palais Brongniart, built by order of Napoleon I. The prestigious Place Vendôme, whose statue of Napoleon dressed as a Roman emperor replaced the statue of Louis XIV, torn down by the revolutionaries. The stone column is covered with bronze plaques from melted down Russian and Austrian cannons captured at the Battle of Austerlitz. When you have wings, distances take on a whole new dimension. The Seine and the Tuileries Garden lie close to one of the capital's most iconic landmarks. In January 1858, Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie miraculously survived an assassination attempt as they left the Opéra, which was then located in the Rue Le Pelletier. Soon after the incident, the state decided it was in the public interest to build a new opera house in a safer area. The architect Garnier embarked on an adventure that was to last 15 years. An artificial lake even had to be dug deep beneath the site to prevent groundwater from further flooding the foundations. Haussmann then laid out a wide avenue linking the building to the Tuileries Palace, where Napoleon lived, in order to guarantee his safety. The Grand Boulevard would replace the intricate network of narrow, winding streets in the heart of the capital. This was also the age of the advent of the grands magasins, or department stores, which throughout the 19th century vied with each other in luxury and creativity. The façade and the dome of Printemps, for example, are listed historic buildings. The Boulevard des Capucines, where the Lumière brothers' first film screenings were held in the basement of the Grand Café, links the Opera House to the Madeleine Church. Designed in 1814, following the victory at Jena, it is one of the many monuments paying tribute to the great army of the Emperor Napoleon I. Work on the building came to a halt with Napoleon's defeat in the Russian campaign, recommencing many years later in the reign of Louis XVIII. Surrounded by grooved columns with Corinthian capitals and boasting a wide pediment decorated with scenes of the Last Judgment, Madeleine Church is more reminiscent of an ancient Greek temple than a traditional Western church. The magnificent obelisk from Luxor, dominating the Place de la Concorde, was given to France by Egypt in 1831. It took 2 years to transport it from the Nile to the Seine on a specially designed boat. This 3,300-year-old Egyptian artifact was erected before the eyes of thousands of Parisians. It was recently adorned with a gold-leaf bronze pyramidion, an exact replica of the lost original dating from the reign of Ramses II. The Louvre and the Tuileries Garden mark the start of a wonderful vista in time and in space. The Place de la Concorde, the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe form an historic axis culminating 8 kilometers further west in one of the capital's most futuristic monuments commissioned by President Mitterrand, the Arch of Fraternity, or Grande Arche, in the heart of La Défense business district. The Place Charles de Gaulle, laid out by houseman around the Arc de Triomphe, is known by Parisians as the Place de l'Étoile. Every evening since 1923, underneath the arch, the eternal flame by the tomb of the unknown soldier burns symbolically in the night sky. For the uninitiated, the 12 large avenues which fan out from here form one of the most challenging driving experiences on Earth. The top of the Arc de Triomphe commands a remarkable view of the Champs-Élysées from one side and La Défense from the other. Paris's public parks and gardens appeared in the 19th century. Much appreciated by the capital's bourgeoisie, they boasted in their heyday bandstands, open-air concerts, restaurants and refreshment stalls. In the 18th century, before the Parc Monceau became a public park, it was the property of the Duke of Chartres. Wishing to give the grounds a unique and rather whimsical touch, he commissioned buildings of every style and age imaginable. The ruins of a Gothic castle, a minaret, a Dutch windmill, an Egyptian pyramid. These follies, which made the garden famous, no longer exist today. All that remains is a Normatia, an ornamental pond surrounded by Corinthian columns inspired by the small lakes on which famous naval battles were reenacted in antiquity. In the 19th century, universal expositions, or world fairs, were an important part of the calendar in Europe's capitals. And architects rivaled each other in daring innovations. These fairs lasted up to 6 months and drew millions of visitors from all over the world. Some buildings were demolished once the party was over, while others, such as the Eiffel Tower or the Grand Palais, remained, changing the capital's landscape forever. The 1900 Exposition Universelle was a major event, attracting some 51 million visitors to Paris for the occasion. The Grand and the Petit Palais were designed especially for it. The austere stone-clad facades of the Grand Palais, which took 3 years to build, contrast with the exuberant ornamentation of the metal girders supporting its giant glass roof. As for the Petit Palais, it now houses the phenomenal collections of the Museum of Fine Arts of the city of Paris. Given to France by the Tsar at the time of the 1900 exhibition, the Pont Alexandre III forms a link between the Invalides and the Champs-Élysées. It crosses the river in one span. This bridge represents one of the world's first prefabricated structures, whose steel parts were transported by boat along the Seine. Stone sculptures and gilded bronze statues made it one of the most ornate bridges in Paris. This large green space, formerly a parade ground, spreads its sweeping lawns from the Seine to the Invalides. The famous dome, beneath which lies Napoleon's tomb, was regilded in 1989 with almost 600,000 sheets of gold leaf. In his royal edict of 1670, Louis XIV stipulated that the Hôtel National des Invalides was to be used for soldiers discharged for old age or as a result of war wounds. It is still home to 100-odd wounded or retired French veterans, but also houses several museums and a military necropolis. Built in just 2 years and 2 months for the 1889 World Fair, the Eiffel Tower, with its 7,000 tons of metal girders, stands over 300 meters tall. Although its structure was regarded as a feat of precision engineering, it was by no means universally popular. Guy de Maupassant claimed he couldn't stand the sight of it, while Paul Verlaine preferred to make a detour to avoid it. In 1903, it even narrowly escaped demolition. Today, the elegance of its skeleton-like frame makes it the highlight of any tour of the capital. What would Paris be without its Iron Lady? All day and late into the night, the red and yellow lifts disgorge some 6 million visitors who come here every year from all over the world. The Pont d'Iéna, commissioned by Napoleon just before the fall of the empire, leads to the Trocadero Gardens, gently sloping down towards the Seine. The imposing buildings of the Palais de Chaillot and the Museum of Modern Art were designed for the 1937 International Exhibition. The esplanade commands a majestic view of the Eiffel Tower. At the foot of the Eiffel Tower, the vast lawns of the Champ de Mars were once the setting for horse races and also witnessed the very first balloon flights in history. Together with the Garde Républicaine, the École Militaire is the last place horses can be found in Paris. Founded by Louis XV to instruct poor gentlemen in the art of war, this place, steeped in history, is run along the traditional lines of a military riding school. It is still home to a master bootmaker specialized in leatherwork and saddle making, and a master tailor responsible for making military uniforms. Today, the École Militaire is also an ultra-modern training center for high-ranking officers in the French armed forces. The Paris of the Butte Montmartre is quite unlike the rest of the capital. The quarter of Pigalle is one of the liveliest and busiest in Paris at all times of day or night. The success of cabarets such as the Moulin Rouge, with its imaginative and original decor, was instant. This is where legendary French cabaret singer Miss Dinguette made her debut. As one climbs towards Montmartre, the winding lanes are redolent of poetry, music, art, and bohemia, synonymous with the interwar period, a time of insouciance and frenzied creativity. Back then, you might bump into Renoir, Utrillo, Matisse, or Picasso, who all spent time at the Bateau Lavoir, an artist's residence clinging to the Butte. Time seems to have stood still beneath the parasols of the Place du Théâtre, invaded by portrait painters and hordes of tourists. Under the watchful eye of the Sacré-Cœur Basilica, on the first Saturday of October each year, people still gather to celebrate the grape harvest in the last remaining vineyard, which produces the only true wine of Paris, Clos Montmartre. Before the village of Montmartre was annexed to Paris in Napoleon III's day, wine was much cheaper on these slopes where it was made in abundance. Since 1885, perpetual adoration of the Blessed Sacrament has continued uninterrupted in the Sacré-Cœur Basilica for the entire world. The building of the basilica was an adventure undertaken as a challenge. Its architect drew inspiration from the Roman Byzantine style of St. Sophia's in Constantinople and St. Mark's in Venice. The unstable ground required extensive foundation work. 83 piles were driven 45 meters into the ground in order to stabilize the structure. The huge square bell tower houses the Savoyarde, the biggest bell in France. The landscape park of the Buttes-Chaumont is the steepest and one of the most romantic gardens in Paris. It took 1,000 workmen, 100 horses and 2 steam engines to turn this former gypsum quarry into a magnificent park. Opened at the time of the 1867 Universal Exhibition, it boasts a rocky island crowned with a small temple accessed by a suspended footbridge. In the 19th and 20th arrondissement of Paris, just below the park, are small pockets of former workmen's houses, now highly sought after. A stroll in the hamlet of Danube, or in the quarter of Saint-Fargeau, is like a walk in a rural world. Calm greenery galore, with houses adorned with Virginia creeper and fragrant climbing wisteria. The hustle and bustle of Paris seems miles away. Father de la Chaise, Louis XIV's confessor, lived on a vast Jesuit estate. Many years later, it became Père Lachaise Cemetery. Brongniart produced the basic design of this huge English-style garden, which today's visitor is advised to explore with a map. When it opened in 1804, the Parisians snubbed this wooded hill outside of the city limits for a long time. They only changed their minds when the city moved the illustrious remains of Heloise and Abelard, as well as those of Molière and La Fontaine, to Père Lachaise. This was long before such stars as Jim Morrison or Edith Piaf came to rest here. In the Place de la Nation, les deux colonnes du trône, the 2 columns of the throne, were once part of an 80-kilometer-long barrier around the city, built to levy taxes on goods entering Paris. From the square, a wide tree-lined avenue which Louis XIV and his wife traveled along after their wedding in Saint-Jean-de-Luz, leads directly to the Bois de Vincennes. The park's most famous landmark is the rock in the Vincennes Zoo. It was Napoleon III who decided to make the Bois de Vincennes and the Bois de Boulogne the capital's lungs. Former royal hunting grounds, these large green spaces to the west and the east of the capital allows city dwellers to forget the stresses of urban life by making the countryside accessible at the very gates of the city. Even today, they are oases for Parisians in search of escape and nature. For a while, Paris has revealed itself to us in all its splendor and allowed us to glimpse it from another aspect. Generously and casually, the city whose secrets we thought we'd penetrated by walking its streets, visiting its parks, and climbing its steeples, has allowed us to fly over it and to rediscover the wealth of its history. Like a bird in the sky, we have had an experience as unique as the beauty of Paris itself.